I'm going to say 3 statements to start this video, because under a new set of proposed laws in Australia, all 3 of these statements could potentially be treated as criminal offences with penalties of up to 5 years in jail. Okay, number 1. Large-scale immigration from conservative Islamic societies can shift social norms in illiberal ways. Number 2. Australia is a better country than China because we have democracy and they have authoritarian rule. And number 3. Islam as a belief system contains ideas that are hostile to liberal values like free speech, women's equality, and gay rights. I think for many, these are perfectly reasonable statements. You can agree with them, debate them, do whatever you want really. But I never would have thought that simply saying them could potentially land you a prison sentence. Longer, by the way, than many violent criminals actually get in Australia. This is the result of new legislative changes the Australian government is trying to pass, which they say are to combat hate speech and hate organisations in the country. Sure, if you take them at their word, that sounds fine. But once you actually look at what's being suggested and who it actually impacts, something pretty dire becomes clear very quickly. Free speech in Australia after almost a century might be on the way out, and criticism of certain ideas, especially religious ones like Islam, is becoming a very high-risk activity in this country. Well, before I dive into the details, let's start not with a welcome to country, but with what Albanese actually said about this bill.
The legislation will then be debated on Tuesday in the House of Representatives. We intend to have that legislation pass the House before question time, which will occur at the normal time at 2 o'clock, and then will be considered by the Senate in the afternoon in order to ensure its passage on that day. The bill is the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism Bill. It's a comprehensive package of reforms which creates serious offences for hate preachers and leaders seeking to radicalise young Australians. It increases the penalties for hate crimes offences. It ensures that offenders whose crimes were motivated by extremism have that factored into their sentencing. It creates a new offence for inciting hatred in order to intimidate or harass. It expands and strengthens the ban on prohibited symbols, and it makes it easier for the Minister for Home Affairs to cancel or refuse a visa for people intent on spreading hatred. And it creates a new framework that will enable the Minister for Home Affairs to list organisations as prohibited hate groups. Once an organisation is listed, it will be a criminal offence to be a member, to recruit for it, to donate or receive funds or support that group in any way.
Notice something? Or rather, did you notice what wasn't said? No mention of radical Islam. No mention of what actually triggered this bill in the first place. Of course he didn't mention it. Now, let's skip forward to Tony Burke, the Home Affairs Minister, the man in charge of our immigration system. And just so you know before I play this, his electorate has around 20 times the national average of Muslims, and it's also where the Bondi attackers came from.
There have been organisations which have played a game for a long time in keeping themselves just below the legal threshold. They were called out last year by Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, for the real harm that they do to our national security. The 2 groups that he called out specifically were the Nazis, the National Socialist Network, and Hizb ut-Tahrir. 2 groups which, through their spreading of hate, have a direct impact on increased risk in our national security environment.
Notice how he mentions neo-Nazis before Hizb ut-Tahrir? Post-Bondi, instead of talking about radical Islam, people like Burke keep pivoting to neo-Nazis over and over. And if you didn't know this, many groups leading the Palestine protests in Australia, like Stand for Palestine, for example, are fronts run by Hizb ut-Tahrir. So yes, that creates a pretty awkward political problem, but a large chunk of your electorate overlaps with these networks. Side note, if you enjoyed the video and the channel so far, please remember to give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. This channel is entirely fan-supported, so if you want to support the work and the mission behind it, consider joining Patreon and becoming part of that mission. That's what keeps the channel alive, lets me do more of this, and it also gets you early access, longer and uncensored videos, written articles, and access to member-only chats. Going back to the legislation itself, there are a lot of issues here. I'll walk you through the worst one, the parts that could genuinely change what you're allowed to say online and in public very soon. The first and most important thing to understand is how this law defines hate. Of course, if you have paid attention to how limitations on free speech have been put in place all over the Western world, this is where it usually begins, with apparent hate. But in the case of this bill, it's not really about threats or even about direct harassment. It's whether a reasonable person in a group might feel intimidated, harassed, or fearful because of something you said. They don't actually need to be harmed or threatened. Nothing really needs to have actually happened. But the probability they must just feel a certain way. I'm sorry, but this is dystopian. A victimless crime, and one that might not have even really happened. Actually, wasn't the entire plot of the second Captain America movie entirely about laws like this? The bad guys were the ones passing these laws, by the way. Overall, this is essentially how you build a censorship machine that runs on political pressure. And it gets worse. The law doesn't just ban hate, it bans the promotion of hostility, contempt, or ridicule toward protected groups. Think about those words for a second. Hostility is not violence. Contempt is not violence. Ridicule is not violence. All these phrases can apply to comedy, satire, criticism, the things that form half the internet. Imagine South Park episodes, or even closer to home, videos I've made on Al-Zot, for example, could all fall under this. What the government is proposing here is not criminalising harm, they're criminalising tone. We're genuinely about to live in a country where someone in power decides your criticism was a bit too uncomfortable or politically incorrect, and that becomes a criminal offence. This is, once again, insanity. Now, curiously though, and I think it's better for me to say rather hypocritically, the government has done something very sneaky. You know how they have been unable to say the root cause of the Bondi shooting was radical Islam? Well, from my perspective as an ex-Muslim, this was rather the real Islam seeping through the cracks. Even Australia's Federal Police Commissioner and the state broadcaster all have been repeatedly saying this has nothing to do with Islam. That is, of course, as they ignore the Islamic State allegiance, the fact that the son was part of a Dawah group, the father and son were radicalized, the son read Islamic doctrine in their manifesto video, which hasn't been released by the way, plus recited Quran verses in the same video, explaining why they did what they did, an Islamic jihad against Jews due to the war in Gaza. Not necessarily new to Islam either, as since the beginning, this grievance has existed, long before Palestine was a thing. So we know the cause is Islamic doctrine, but this law does something insane. Buried inside this bill is a defense that basically says if what you're saying is a direct quote or reference from a religious text, and you're doing it for religious teaching or discussion, that can be protected. Yes, you heard me right. The radical Islamic preachers who radicalize these shooters can cite from the Quran and the Hadith the anti-Semitism contained in these texts, and they would not be charged under this bill. In fact, they are protected. This includes famous hadith like the one about rocks and trees talking to Muslims about Jews. Of course, this means if you or I criticize an idea in our own words, we can be exposed. If we say that hadith is problematic and causes hatred towards Jews, we can be at risk of being thrown into jail for 5 years. But if Sheikh Abdullah reads a hostile verse straight out of his scripture and calls it teaching, that can be protected. Weirdly, when asked about this, Anthony Albanese said, and I kid you not, that this is because the Old Testament has problems and they'd like to protect that. A curiously odd and rather unrelated example there, Mr. Albanese, because last I checked, in the last 30 years, a grand total of 0 Australians have died because someone had been radicalized by the Old Testament and went on to commit an act of terror. And it's insane to me that very shortly, even a completely true statement like that could become a crime with a 5-year jail sentence. It's therefore more important than ever to ensure the government cannot track who you are and where you're posting from. That's exactly why I use Proton VPN and why I think you should too. They're based in Switzerland, outside the reach of US, EU, UK and Australian law. They don't keep logs and are built by the same team behind Proton Mail. When the UK passed its surveillance laws, Proton VPN became the #1 app on the App Store. Their stealth protocol beats censorship firewalls. Secure Core routes your traffic through privacy-first countries, and NetShield blocks trackers before they ever reach you. I've used Proton Mail since Australia announced sweeping surveillance laws last year, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it's now essential. If you want to protect your privacy and support this channel, hit the link below to get up to 60% off Proton VPN. Radicalization does not start with someone yelling, "Go commit violence." It starts with, "The Quran says this. The scholars say this. These people are corrupt," or "the West is evil." That's how it starts and that's how it's taught. I've seen this happen firsthand. Otherwise normal people being shown these scriptures and getting radicalized very quickly. This law doesn't only miss that, it shields it. Oh, and we aren't done yet. Then you get to the hate group provisions. This bill makes it easier for the government to declare an organisation a prohibited hate group based on broad, fuzzy concepts like social harm or community harm. Not necessarily violence, not necessarily criminal convictions, just harm. And once a group is listed, everything connected to it becomes radioactive. Its symbols become illegal to display, its supporters can be criminalised, and even association becomes suspect. What makes that worse is that this designation can be based on conduct from the past, even before the law existed, and the government doesn't even have to afford full procedural fairness when doing it. That should terrify you, not because you love extremists, but because you don't trust politicians to define extremism neutrally. Today it's radicals you hate, tomorrow it's people you agree with. All of this is happening in the context of a law that was rushed out after a terrorist attack. Anthony Albanese and his government want to be seen as doing something. He rejected a royal commission for weeks before finally agreeing to one. I believe he tried to put it off because such an examination of his government is likely going to expose the fact that his government didn't take action against the clear, hateful environment created against Australian Jews, because the people responsible formed multiple electorates that heavily lean Labor. I have spoken often about this very real problem Western countries are having to contend with today. If you invite large groups of people with ideas antithetical to Western civilization and give them voting rights, you will eventually have to come to decide whether to give in to demands that are completely against the fundamental ideas that form the country. Our government today is being held hostage. This bill, hastily put forward and vague enough to earn them political points, is to show that they are doing something, which they aren't really. They love these vague laws with emotional justifications because they give them power without accountability. And rather undemocratically, this 500-page bill is being pushed through without giving anybody much time to actually go through it and debate its merits. This is precisely how you end up with a system that doesn't dismantle radical pipelines, doesn't touch recruitment, funding or training, and doesn't stop ideological grooming. 15 Australians died in Bondi. The government is now using their debts to create laws that won't allow you to criticise the people responsible. That is the state of Australia today. Look, I know my channel gets people of varying political ideas. Some of you lean right, left, centre. Many of you are here because you like hearing from an ex-Muslim. Many of you have been impacted by Islam itself in some way or the other. Maybe some of you like my mask, I don't know. But if you are Australian, I want you to think very carefully about the path our country is walking. And I want you to remember this whenever you are headed to vote, whether that be state or federal, I don't care. The Labor Party understandably came into power because the coalition had monumentally fucked up the last decade or so. But in a rather short time, Labor is perhaps doing even more damage and is about to change the entire concept of free expression in this country forever.